Young orc girl, abandoned by her family, spent years waiting for someone who never came back. She had been waiting for 12 years when the sky cracked open and something fell out of it. Not fell, that was the wrong word. Things fell. Stones fell. Rain fell. What came through the atmosphere above the Ashrock Flats came down the way a fist comes down. Purposeful, committed, trailing fire in a long copper streak that lit the underside of the clouds before dawn had any right to be thinking about color. Gracia saw it from the roof of the way station, where she had gone to check the condensation traps before the heat climbed too high to breathe in. She was 23 years old, and she had lived alone in this place since she was 11, and she had learned in that time not to run towards strange things. She ran anyway. The way station sat at the edge of what the old transit maps called Corridor 7, a 400-kilometer strip of rust-colored flats between the mountains of Drek Hollow and the Chemical Sea. No ships came through Corridor 7 anymore. The Voth had seen to that. They had dropped a resonance cage into the corridor's upper atmosphere 8 years ago, a lattice of humming black nodes the size of houses that scrambled navigation computers and made organic pilots bleed from the ears if they tried to punch through. Since then, the Ashrock Flats had been as quiet as a held breath, and Gracia had watched the sky every morning the way you watch for someone who promised to come back and hasn't. Her mother had promised. The crash site was 3 kilometers from the way station, behind the second ridge. Gracia covered the distance in just under 20 minutes, her boots throwing up small puffs of rust-red dust with each step, her right hand on the grip of the arc pistol she'd stripped from a dead Voth scout 4 years ago and spent 6 months learning to fire. She crested the ridge and stopped. The ship was not large. It was roughly oblong, its hull the color of old bone, and it had come down hard enough to carve a trench 40 meters long through the packed earth. Steam rose from the trench edges. The ship itself had cracked along its midsection like a broken rib, and from the crack a thin blue light pulsed, slow and steady as a sleeping heartbeat. She stood on the ridge for a long time. The arc pistol was in her hand without her deciding to draw it. Then something moved inside the wreck. The hatch wasn't a hatch so much as a section of hull that had buckled outward, and the figure that came through it came through on hands and knees before managing to stand. He was human. She could tell from 15 meters away, the proportions, the way he moved, the single head and bilateral symmetry, and all the small visual cues that her biology recognized before her brain caught up. Human, male, approximately her age or a little older, wearing a flight suit that had seen better decades. He had dark hair matted to one temple with blood, and he stood with the careful, experimental quality of someone testing whether his legs still worked. He looked up and saw her standing on the ridge with the gun pointed at him. He raised both hands. "I know how this looks," he said. His name was Kale Duras, and he had been running from the Voth for 11 days. She found this out over the next 3 hours, as she helped him back to the way station with one of his arms across her shoulders, because his left knee had taken damage in the landing, and he couldn't manage the ridge alone. He talked while they walked. She gathered this was his way of managing pain, words as a buffer between the body and what the body was feeling. He talked about the ship, which he called the Harriet, and which he had stolen from a Voth impound dock in the Kessler system. He talked about the resonance cage above Corridor 7, and how he had found the gap in it, a 6-meter flaw in the lattice node above Marker 88 that the Voth had never bothered to fix because no human navigator should have been able to calculate it without a working computer, and he had calculated it without a working computer. He talked about the rebellion, which was the first time Gracia had heard anyone use that word in 12 years without lowering their voice. She said nothing, she listened. She noted the weight of him against her shoulder, and the smell of burned circuitry, and the particular rhythm of his breathing, which was fast with adrenaline but not shallow with fear. She noted his hands when he gestured. The knuckles were scarred in the specific way of someone who had spent time fighting in close quarters, and the third finger of his left hand bore a faded tattoo of a small compass rose, needle pointing inward toward his palm instead of outward. When they reached the way station, she sat him down on the equipment crate she used as a chair and stood back and looked at him properly. "You said the rebellion," she said, the first words she had spoken since she found him. He looked at her with an attention that most people did not give her, because most people did not stay long enough in the Ashrock flats to look at anything carefully. "Yes," he said. "The Voth will come looking for you. Probably within 48 hours. The Harriet had a Voth tracker node in its hull that I didn't find until after I was already through the cage. I burned it out, but they'll have a rough trajectory." Gracia looked at the ceiling, the corrugated metal, the rust stains where the condensation traps sometimes overflowed. She had lived inside this ceiling for 12 years, looked up at it in the dark, traced the rust stains with her eyes on sleepless nights, and she knew every centimeter of it the way you know the face of someone who does not come back. "You can stay until your knee is functional," she said. "Then you leave." He nodded, understood. She found him food, dried protein blocks, reconstituted grain, a jar of the salt-pickled roots that grew in the crack behind the northern wall. She found him a clean cloth and the small medical kit that she had assembled over years from the supplies left behind by travelers passing through back when travelers still passed through. She watched him clean the cut on his temple with methodical efficiency and tape it without wincing, and she thought about how she had learned to do exactly that same thing by herself in this room when she was 14 years old and had cut her hand open on a sharp edge in the generator housing, and there had been no one to call. "You're Orson," he said. Not a question, not a judgment, just observation. "Half," she said. He nodded, accepting this the way you accept weather. The Orson were what happened when the first humans arrived in this sector 300 years ago and found a species already living here, shorter than humans, with dense gray-green skin adapted for the chemical-heavy atmospheres of the inner worlds, secondary eyelids that filtered radiation, and a bone structure that made them look heavy even when they weren't. What had followed was the usual history, the kind that gets written in a specific vocabulary of euphemism and administrative language, resettlement programs, integrated zones, the blend era. Gracia's mother had been full-blood Orson. Her father had been human and gone before she could walk. Her mother had brought her to the way station when the Voth occupation made the integrated zones lethal, left her there with 3 months of supplies and instructions on operating the equipment, and gone to join what she called the first movement. She had not come back. Gracia did not say any of this to Kale Duras. She said, "Sleep, I'll watch." He slept. She watched the horizon through the way station's narrow windows, the arc pistol across her knees, and tried to remember what it felt like to believe that someone was coming. On the first morning, she climbed to the roof before he woke and checked the condensation traps the way she always did, and she stood at the roof's edge and looked at the sky and thought about the 12 years in a way she rarely permitted herself. It was not productive thinking. It moved in the familiar spiral. The first year, when she had kept the communication console powered and broadcasting on her mother's frequency. The third year, when she had accepted that broadcasting was a risk she could not justify and had gone to listening only. The 6th year, when the Voth had dropped the cage and the silence had become absolute. The 8th year, when she had started mapping the cage because there was nothing else to do with the understanding that no one was coming and the energy had to go somewhere. The maps were not hope, exactly. They were what hope becomes when it runs out of reasons and keeps going anyway, out of sheer habit or stubbornness, or the specific refusal to accept that something cannot be done simply, because all the evidence suggests it cannot be done. The rust-red morning opened around her in every direction, flat and still. She went back down and made breakfast, and when Kale woke she had food waiting, which he received without fuss, and they ate in a silence that was not uncomfortable in the way silence is usually uncomfortable between strangers. It was the silence of two people who are both accustomed to their own company, and therefore not made anxious by quiet. "How long have you been here alone?" he asked. "Since I was 11. He stopped chewing for a moment, then continued. He did not offer sympathy, which she noted and appreciated. "The way station was designed for two-person operation," he said, looking at the equipment racks. "You've been doing it solo." It required some adjustment. She looked at the racks. Mostly in the first year. After that it was a system. He nodded slowly. "When I was 12, he said, "I spent 8 months in a Voth processing camp on Hessen 3. By myself, I mean. There were other people there, hundreds of them, but alone in the specific way that means no one who belongs to you. When they finally got us out, I didn't know how to be in a room with people for about 6 weeks. The noise was wrong." She looked at him. He was looking at the wall. "I imagine," she said, "it might be somewhat analogous." "Probably not identical," he said, "but adjacent." This was, she thought, the most honest thing anyone had said to her in a long time. She had found, in the occasional interactions with travelers in the early years before the cage, that people tended to respond to her circumstances in one of two ways: with a kind of aggressive sympathy that wanted her to perform gratitude for their concern, or with a brisk practicality that refused to acknowledge that the circumstances were worth acknowledging at all. Cale had done neither. He had offered a comparable data point and held it open without pressing. "My mother left a mark on the wall before she went," she said. She did not know why she said this. She had not said it to anyone. "A character Orson script. I didn't know what it meant for years. I found a partial reference in a salvaged language archive when I was 17. I will return. That's what it means." He was quiet for a moment. "Do you believe it?" he said. "I believe she meant it when she made the mark," she said. "Whether the meaning survived whatever happened to her is a separate question." He looked at his food. "Fair answer," he said. She was better by morning. He was better by morning. That was the wrong thought. She had been fine. He was better by morning. He was better by morning. He was mobile enough by the second morning to walk without assistance, and he went with her on the equipment check. The condensation traps, the generator, the sensor array she'd rebuilt twice and would likely rebuild a third time before the year was out. He moved carefully but without complaint, and he paid attention to the equipment with the hands-on interest of someone who had spent time doing maintenance work, not just directing it. She showed him the sensor array, which was not the original array but a composite she'd built from 3 different salvaged systems and wired together with a logic she'd invented because no manual covered what she was trying to do. He studied it for a while. "This shouldn't work," he said. "It works," she said. "The signal processing is. You've got 3 different handshake protocols running in sequence. The first system filters for Voth carrier frequencies. The second parses the pulse timing. The third decodes the lattice geometry from the pulse signatures. They have to run in sequence or the output is noise." He turned to look at her. "You built this." "Over about 2 years. The first version was much simpler. As I learned more about how the cage worked, I rebuilt it." "Where did you learn about how the cage worked?" "I figured it out," she said simply. He was quiet for a moment, with the particular quietness of someone revising their working model of a situation. She found him a clean cloth and the small medical kit that she had assembled over years, and they went back inside, and she showed him the maps. He was better by morning. That was still the wrong thought. She had been fine. They spent most of the day at the maps. She explained the methodology, the shortwave receiver she'd built from salvaged parts, the way she'd learned to read the node pulse signatures, the months of timing data that let her predict when each gap opened and for how long. He asked precise questions. He listened to her answers with the focused quality of someone who was actually processing information, rather than waiting for his turn to speak. And she found, to her own irritation, that this was disarming in a way she had not prepared for. In the late afternoon, he said, "The rebellion has been trying to crack that cage for 3 years. We've lost 7 pilots trying to find the gaps." "I know." He looked at her. "I picked up rebel signal traffic 2 years ago," she said. "Coded, but not well enough. I've been listening." "And you didn't transmit?" "Who would I transmit to? The signal traffic was fragmented. No source coordinates. Nothing actionable." She rolled up the map of Node Gap 3 and set it on the stack. "And I didn't know if it was a Voth operation. Broadcasting my position on a rebel frequency when it might be a Voth trap seemed unwise." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "That's either paranoid or smart." "Both," she said. "Usually both are the same thing." The corner of his mouth moved. The first suggestion of something like a smile. She looked away. At dusk, he sat outside the way station door, and she brought him the last of the protein blocks, and sat on the step with her back against the doorframe, and they watched the sky change colors over the Ashrock Flats, copper to rust to a deep arterial red before the stars came out. The stars came out differently here than anywhere else she'd been, because she'd only been here, and she had no comparison. But she had always thought they came out the way certain emotions arrive, all at once, and permanent seeming and cold. "What are you waiting for?" he asked. She didn't answer immediately. She watched the first of the Voth navigation nodes blink into visibility in the upper atmosphere. Its pulse, a slow green-white that she could now identify by frequency alone. "My mother left me here," she said. "She said she'd come back." "When?" 12 years ago." He was quiet. "I know what that silence means," she said. "I've known for years. I'm not actually waiting. I just haven't found a reason to leave yet." She looked at the pistol across her knees. "Everything I know is in those maps. If I leave, the maps come with me. But going somewhere requires having somewhere to go." He looked at her for a long time, the kind of looking that costs something. "I have somewhere to go," he said. She said nothing. "The Harriet is repairable. 3, maybe 4 days of work. The frame is cracked, but the drive is intact and the navigation system survived. If I have your maps, I can find every gap in that cage. I can get back to the fleet." He paused. "And I can take you to the rebellion. To people, other people. A place with enough of us that the Voth can't just," he stopped, started again. "There are others like you there. Half Orson, full Orson, from the integrated zones, from the inner worlds. The Voth don't distinguish. Anyone they want gone, we take in." She looked up at the navigation node, watched its green-white pulse, counted the seconds between beats the way she had done 10,000 times before, all the data organized in her head in tidy columns, all the gaps mapped and memorized. "Help me fix the ship first," she said. "Then we'll talk about the rest." The Voth came on the second day. She had been half expecting it. She had calculated the window from what Kale had told her about the tracker node's burnout time and the probable response radius, and the numbers had said day 2 or day 3. So when the distant thunder rolled in from the eastern sky at mid-morning, she did not panic. She set down the coupling seal she'd been threading into the Harriet's cracked hull joint, stood up straight and said, "They're early." Kale was 3 meters away, belly down under the drive housing, and he was out from under it in 4 seconds. He had the look of someone who had been chased before and had developed efficient protocols for it. "How many?" She was already climbing the ridge. She got to the top and shielded her eyes against the flat white morning glare and counted. 2 Voth patrol vessels, the mid-sized kind called Blades, long and narrow with the characteristic double-swept wings, coming in low over the eastern flats at maybe 300 meters altitude. Fast but not combat speed. Search pattern, not assault approach. They hadn't pinpointed the site yet. 2 Blades, she said when Kale reached the ridge beside her. Search sweep. They'll find the Harriet's crash trench in one pass. How long do we have? She watched the Blades approach vector. Calculated. 9 minutes before they're directly overhead. Maybe 12 before they commit to a landing approach. The Harriet is 3 days from flight capable. I know. She was already moving. The way station had been built, originally, as a transit support facility, fuel depot, emergency shelter, basic maintenance capability. The fuel depot function had been defunct for years, the tanks dry, but the tanks themselves were still there. 4 large underground cisterns, accessible via a maintenance hatch behind the northern wall. Gracia had not thought of them as anything but storage for years. She thought of them now as the specific kind of structural cavity that could hide a ship. Not easily, not without damage, but the Harriet was already damaged. She explained this to Cale in approximately 45 seconds as they jogged back down the ridge toward the crash site. He listened without interrupting, which she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him, and then said, "The port stabilizer vane is sheared if we try to land in a confined space without it. I know we'll lose the vane entirely, possibly damage the port drive nacelle." She was already at the Harriet's hatch. How critical is the port nacelle? Not critical for a short hop, critical for anything over 400 kilometers. The nearest gap in the cage is 212 kilometers from here. Another silence of the specific vertigo variety. "Get in," he said. They got the Harriet off the ground with 6 minutes to spare, barely. The drive screamed in a way that suggested opinions about the state it was being asked to operate in, and the navigation board threw 4 error flags simultaneously. And Gracia, strapped into the co-pilot seat with her hands on a console she had never touched before in her life, discovered that she could read Voth navigational notation, because she had been staring at captured Voth signal traffic for 4 years, and the notation had simply become legible to her the way anything becomes legible if you look at it long enough. She navigated them into the cistern. The port vane scraped concrete. The sound was structural. 2 of the lights on the board went from yellow to red. Cale set them down on the cistern floor with a controlled crash that was nonetheless a crash, and they sat in the ringing silence for a moment before he said, very quietly, "That was extraordinary." "It worked," she said. Her hands were shaking. She put them flat on her knees and looked at them until they stopped. Above them, through 2 meters of compacted earth and concrete, the Voth blades swept over the way station. She counted the seconds. She knew the search pattern. She had watched Voth blades work this region for 8 years. They would make 3 passes over the crash trench, deploy a ground sensor drone, wait 20 minutes for sensor returns, and then either land or move on. The trench was there. The wreckage of the crash was there. But the Harriet was not, and the cisterns were old enough, and their construction materials dense enough to deflect the standard organic signature sensors. Probably. She sat in the dark of the cistern with Cale Duras and the damaged ship and the maps that were committed to her memory, and she held very still, and she waited. This was something she was practiced at. After 40 minutes, the sound of the blade's drives faded east. She let out a breath that felt like it had been sitting in her lungs for longer than 40 minutes. "We still have the repair problem," Cale said. "Yes. Port nacelle is worse than I thought. We need a phase coupler. I don't have a spare." She thought about this. The Voth Scout I scavenged 4 years ago. I stripped most of it, but I left the drive housing because it was fused and I didn't think I needed it. It's in the eastern ravine, about 7 kilometers out. She paused. Voth phase couplers run a different frequency standard than human-built drives, but the coupling interface is compatible. I can show you the notation. I know how to adjust the frequency match. He looked at her the way people sometimes look at things they weren't expecting to find. "Of course you do," he said. It wasn't dismissive. It wasn't even entirely surprised. It was something else, recognition maybe. The specific look of someone seeing a reflection. "I've had a lot of time," she said. They went for the coupler the next morning before dawn, moving through the rust-red dark with the small chemical lights she'd been hoarding for years. The ravine was exactly as she'd left it. The Voth Scout sat in its shallow impact crater, hull corroded, and several panels open where she'd stripped them, but the drive housing was intact. Cale worked the coupler free with tools that were precisely what they needed because she'd told him what tools to bring. She held the chemical light and passed him things and watched the sky. On the way back, she asked him about the rebellion. He told her not the sanitized version she sensed, but something closer to the truth. The fleet was 300 ships, a mix of human and Orcin, and a dozen other species the Voth had been systematically displacing for 40 years. They operated out of a mobile station called the Archon that relocated every 90 days. They had fighters and they had engineers and they had medics and they had, increasingly, former occupied zone residents who had survived under Voth control and brought with them a specific kind of knowledge. How the Voth thought, how they organized, what they wanted and what they feared. "What do they fear?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. "They fear anything they can't quantify," he said. "They're an extremely precise species. They map everything, populations, resources, variables. They have this concept, the word translates roughly as structural uncertainty, which is what they call any situation where the variables exceed their calculation capacity. It's the closest thing they have to panic. When something happens that they didn't model, he paused. They don't handle it well." She thought about the resonance cage, the 6-meter flaw above marker 88 that they'd never bothered to fix because no human navigator should have been able to find it. The assumption embedded in that neglect, that the cage's targets would behave predictably, would stay where they'd been put, would not spend 12 years alone on a flat desert watching the sky and mapping the mathematics of their own imprisonment. "Structural uncertainty," she said. "Yes." "Good," she said. The coupler installation took most of the next day. Cale worked, and she handed him things and read him the frequency adjustment specifications from the Voth notation she'd memorized, and somewhere in the middle of the afternoon he said, without looking up from the housing, "Your mother was in the first movement." It was not a question. She said yes. A lot of the first movement made it out. There were extractions after the Voth consolidated the inner worlds. People got out. He was still not looking up. His hands were steady on the torque driver. "I don't know specifically. I don't have a name." "Sira Oshgren," she said. The name felt strange in her mouth. She had not said it in years. She was a signals coordinator. She had a secondary eyelid scar on her left side from a radiation incident when she was young. She stopped, started again. Not tall. She had this way of standing with her weight on her right foot when she was thinking. She used to hum while she worked. I don't know what song, something from the inner worlds, the old Orcin music. I used to fall asleep to it. He came out from under the housing and looked at her directly. "I'll ask," he said. "When we get there, I'll ask." She looked at him for a moment. At the blood-cleaned cut on his temple, the compass rose tattoo with the needle pointing inward, the flight suit that had seen better decades. She thought about the 12 years. She thought about the roof of the way station and the condensation traps, and every morning she had looked at the sky. She thought about what he had said about being 12 years old in a Voth processing camp on Hessen 3, the specific aloneness of it, and how he had come through it and made a life and come here. And she thought about the compass rose with its needle pointing inward, and what that might mean to a person who'd spent years finding his way back toward something. She didn't ask. Some questions are answered in the keeping of them. "We'd better finish the housing," she said. They finished the housing. The Harriet was flight-capable by nightfall on the 4th day. Not healthy, the port nacelle ran hot, and the board still had 2 red flags, but functional for the distance they needed to cover. Gracia took 2 hours to copy her maps onto the ship's navigation system. She was thorough. She included the timing data, the frequency signatures, the predictions for each gap opening over the next 30 days. She included 12 years of Voth patrol pattern data that she had kept in a handwritten log under the equipment crate she used as a chair. She uploaded everything. Then she stood in the way station for a while. She had no meaningful possessions. The ARC pistol, the maps, the medical kit, 3 changes of clothes that fit approximately. She had the logbooks, 12 years of logbooks in her mother's handwriting, and then her own, daily entries of sky conditions and sensor readings and maintenance actions, and sometimes, in the early years, other things. She took the logbooks. She was not sentimental about this. They were data. She took one other thing. On the wall above the communication console, at a height that would have been eye level for someone considerably shorter than Gracia, there was a mark in the plaster, a small Orson character, scratched carefully with a tool point. She didn't know what it meant for years. She had not been able to find it in any of the reference materials she had access to until she was 17, and a salvaged language archive filled in the gap. Her mother had made it on the last morning before she left, while Gracia was loading supplies and not watching. She had noticed it 3 days later and realized immediately that it had just been made, and she had never touched it. She could not take the wall. She stood in front of it for a long moment. Then she took the small signal flare gun from the emergency kit, the one she'd never used that she'd been saving without consciously knowing what for, and she pressed the barrel tip gently against the mark and left a corresponding black carbon circle around it on the plaster. As if to say, this was seen. This was known. This was real. She walked out and did not look back. They launched at 300 hours, minimum lights, drive pushed to the quietest output that could still lift them. The night sky over the Ashrock Flats was vast and specific, and Gracia knew it down to the position of every navigation node and the pulse signature of every Voth beacon in the region. She had the gap above marker 88 timed to the second. It opened for 11 minutes every 19 hours, a structural flaw in the resonance lattice that the Voth had modeled as impossible to exploit and had therefore left unaddressed for 8 years, because precision can be its own blindness. Kale flew. She navigated. This was the natural division, and they had arrived at it without discussion, which was itself a kind of language. The ascent was tense for reasons beyond the red-flagged board. The cage was visible on the sensor array as a web of green-white pulses, its nodes spaced across the upper atmosphere in the lattice she had spent years mapping, and approaching it from below had a quality she had not anticipated. The cage that had been an abstract system of data points became, from this angle, a physical thing, a presence, a construction that some intelligence had placed deliberately in the sky above this corridor to keep its people inside. She had known this intellectually for years. Knowing it through the Harrod's underpowered hull, while climbing toward it at an angle she had calculated in a way station with no computer was different. 20 seconds, she said. Her voice was level. Marker 88 is at your 2 o'clock, 3 degrees high. The gap is 6 meters wide, and we have 11 minutes left in the window. Understood, Kale said. If we miss the window, the next opening is 19 hours. The blades may come back before then. I know. I'm telling you so the information is stated, not because I think you need the motivation. He almost smiled. She could hear it in his exhale. Stated, thank you. 10 seconds. She watched the pulse signatures on the array, counting the beats, and at the precise moment the gap peaked, she said, now, and Kale pushed the throttle to full. The resonance cage hit them like a wave of pressure and noise. The array screamed. All the error flags on the board went red simultaneously, and for approximately 4 seconds the cockpit filled with a high-frequency interference that she felt in her secondary eyelids and her back teeth. Then it was gone. All of it, the noise, the pressure, the cage's subsonic hum that she had been inside for so long she'd stopped registering it. Gone. Just silence and stars. She sat in the co-pilot seat and felt it lift away, and did not say anything for a while. Kale let her have the silence. He did not ask if she was all right. She was going to be all right. It was just a matter of giving the moment its appropriate weight before moving through it. The cage, she said finally, is louder from the inside than I expected. It always is, he said. The cage is the noise you get used to. Getting out is the loud part. She thought about this. "Yes," she said, "that's exactly right." 3 hours out from the cage, he raised the fleet on an encrypted channel, gave identification codes and a brief summary, requested approach coordinates to the Archon. There was a delay of 6 minutes, she counted, and then a voice came back, layered through signal processing, and read them coordinates. The voice was female. It had a particular rhythm, a specific cadence, the kind of cadence that is laid down in early childhood and stays regardless of what languages or accents accumulate on top of it afterward. Gracia had heard it in her own voice sometimes, in the long years of talking to herself in the way station, because she needed to hear words in the air. Gracia went very still. Cale had heard it too. He turned to look at her. She could not read his expression because she was not looking at him. She was looking at the communication board. The voice said, "Confirm receipt of coordinates. Archon is waiting." A pause. Then, as if she had heard something, as if some signal had passed through the transmission that the signal processors didn't catch. "Harriet, please confirm your crew manifest." Cale looked at Gracia. She leaned forward and pressed the transmit key. "Harriet crew," she said, "to pilot Cale Duras." She paused for precisely 1 second, and Gracia Oshgren. "Of the Ashrock Flats, Corridor 7. The silence on the other end of the transmission was long enough that she thought the connection had dropped. Then receiving. The voice was not steady. "Harriet, your approach corridor is..." A pause. The pause of someone who is pressing something against their composure with both hands. "Your approach corridor is green. Come in on that bearing. Don't..." Another pause, shorter. "Don't deviate." "Understood," Gracia said. She released the transmit key and sat back and looked at the stars. "Gracia," Cale said. "I know," she said. Her voice was very even. She had spent 12 years keeping her voice even. "I know." They did not speak again for the remaining 40 minutes. The Archon was larger than she had imagined and simultaneously different in ways she hadn't accounted for. She had built it in her head from the intercepted signal traffic, functional, military, a survival infrastructure. What she found was that too, but also something else. The particular density of a place where many people have decided to keep living despite good reasons not to. She could feel it in the atmosphere before the hatch opened, in the way the hull sounds transmitted through her palms on the landing struts, in the noise of the docking bay that reached her before the hatch was fully open. It was the noise of people doing things, 100 kinds of things, with urgency and purpose, and the particular focused energy of individuals who are choosing every day to be here rather than not. Voth would find the Archon eventually. She was clear-eyed about this. The Voth were precise and patient and had resources that made the rebellion seem like a child's counting of coins. But precision is not the same as wisdom, and patience is not the same as adaptability, and resources do not account for 12 years of a half-orphan girl on a dead transitway station, mapping every flaw in your apparently impenetrable cage, and keeping that information ready and intact and waiting for someone to use it. She had the maps, all of them. 7 gaps in the resonance cage above Corridor 7, with timing data and frequency signatures and approach vectors, all of it clean and verified and ready to deliver. Enough to let the rebellion move through a corridor the Voth considered closed. Enough to change the geometry of a war. This was the thing she had not allowed herself to think about too directly in the years of watching the sky. It had seemed too large, too contingent, everything depending on a ship falling through and a person in it who was going somewhere useful. But she had kept the data anyway. She had kept it the way you keep certain things. Not because you are certain they will be needed, but because discarding them would be a particular kind of surrender. The hatch opened. The docking bay was crowded and loud, the noise of a working ship of the line, people moving with purpose, equipment being shifted, voices overlapping in a half-dozen languages. There were faces here she would have known as Orson anywhere, the dense gray-green skin, the secondary eyelid crease, the heavy-boned build of the inner world adaptation. There were humans and others she had no name for, and all of them moving with the quick, purposeful gait of people in the middle of something. She stood in the hatch opening and looked at it. Cale stood beside her. His knee was visibly bothering him, and he had said nothing about it for 4 hours. At the far end of the bay, near the corridor entry, a figure had stopped moving. She was not tall. Her weight was on her right foot. Gracia stepped down from the hatch onto the deck. She did not run. She had not run towards strange things since she learned not to, and she had decided, some years ago, that if this moment came, she would approach it with the same patience she had applied to everything else. She would not let urgency knock her sideways after 12 years of keeping herself upright. She walked across the docking bay. The noise continued around her. Cale followed at a slight distance because he understood something about how to inhabit a moment without crowding it. The woman at the corridor entry had a secondary eyelid scar on her left side that was visible even at this distance, because Gracia had looked for it before she'd fully processed anything else. The gray-green skin of the inner world Orson. The face that was older, obviously older. The years were in it, the specific texture of years that have not been easy. But the architecture of a face is the architecture of a face, and Gracia had been carrying this one in her memory for 12 years against exactly this contingency, and she would have known it in any crowd. They stopped 3 meters apart. Her mother looked at her with the specific look of someone who has been assembling an apology for 12 years and discovered, in the moment of delivery, that it is inadequate. Not because the apology isn't real, because the gap it has to cross is larger than words can span, and they both know it, and the knowing is what gives the look its quality. Gracia let her look. She had learned from the years that looking is sometimes what people need before they can find their way to anything else. "I couldn't come back," her mother said. Her voice was steady. She was Orson enough for that, and 12 years of surviving had added its own layer of steadiness. The inner worlds were sealed, and then the cage went up. "I tried," she stopped, started again. There was no way through. "I know," Gracia said. "I sent signals, coded. I didn't know if." "I received them," Gracia said. 2 years ago, I didn't know they were from you." Her mother closed her eyes for a moment, opened them. "The mark on the wall, the character I left." "I know it now," Gracia said. "I looked it up. Old formal Orson, it means I will return." She paused. "I couldn't take the wall with me. I left a mark around it so it would be seen." Her mother's composure did something specific. Gracia watched it happen. She did not look away because this was something she had earned the right to witness. "I have data," Gracia said. Her voice was level. She had made it level with considerable effort, and she was going to keep it that way for as long as was necessary and possibly longer. 7 gaps in the resonance cage above Corridor 7. Full timing analysis, 12 years of Voth patrol data, frequency matching protocols for adapting standard human navigation systems to thread the gaps. I've uploaded everything to the Harrods navigation system. You'll want your signals people to start processing it immediately because 3 of the timing windows change in the next 6 days. Her mother looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "we will." They stood there in the docking bay, the 2 of them, 3 meters apart, while the rebellion moved around them with its urgency and its noise. The specific 3 meters that had been 12 years long. Then her mother stepped forward and closed the distance, and Gracia, who had kept her composure intact through 12 years of solitude and a Voth patrol sweep, and a controlled crash into a concrete cistern, and 40 minutes of silence across 300 kilometers of open space, found that 3 meters was an easy thing to cross, but a hard thing to recover from having crossed. She recovered. It took a moment. She allowed the moment. Then she stepped back, because there was work to do, and said, "I'll need a full access terminal and your best cartographer. The gaps have to be cross-referenced with current Voth fleet position data before they're actionable, and some of the timing windows are narrow. We'll need to start planning approach sequences for each gap separately. Margin of error is about 40 seconds on the shorter windows." Her mother looked at her with the expression of someone who left a child behind and came back to find that the child had become something she hadn't expected and could not entirely account for. It was not a sad expression. It was something more complicated than sad, the specific grief of time that has passed and cannot be returned, fused with something that was not quite pride because pride implies credit, and her mother had not been here for the years that made Gracia what she was. Whatever it was sat in her face like weather. "I'll get you a terminal," her mother said. "And a cartographer. And a cartographer." Cale was standing near the hatch with his weight carefully off his bad knee, watching this exchange with the quality of someone who has seen a number of things in his travels and is adding this one to the catalog. When Gracia passed him on her way toward the corridor, she said, without stopping, "Thank you." He said, "You did most of the hard parts." She kept walking. The terminal was in a small room off the main operations deck, and the cartographer was a young man named Fane who had 3 Orson grandparents and wore them visibly, and spoke in 3 languages simultaneously when he was excited, which he became as soon as she started laying out the gap data. She answered his questions in order precisely, with the particular patience of someone who has thought about these things alone for years, and is now getting to think about them with another person for the first time. It was unusual, this. The sound of her own voice answering questions that deserved to be asked, the sound of someone else's voice asking them. She worked for 6 hours without stopping. Fane matched her, with coffee and without complaint. By the end of the 6th hour, they had 7 approach profiles for 7 gap windows, ranked by tactical utility and cross-referenced with fleet position data, annotated with risk parameters and the margin of error calculations she had verified twice. The profiles were clean and thorough and represented, without either of them saying so, the kind of work that could open a war. She sat back and looked at the finished work on the screen. 7 gaps in an impenetrable cage. 12 years of a girl on a dead way station watching the sky. Fane saved the file and leaned back in his chair and looked at it for a moment. "This is going to change things," he said. His voice had the quality of someone who means a thing exactly as much as they're saying it. "That's the idea," she said. Outside the room's narrow porthole, the stars were the same stars. Of course they were. But they were different from this side, and she had come through on her own terms and brought what she had, and she would not waste time pretending that this was not exactly what it was. The Voth had modeled the inhabitants of the Ashrock Flats as inert, a quantity that would diminish over time from attrition or persist as a negligible variable in a closed system. They had built a cage and assumed the caged would think inside it. They had calculated the human capacity for adaptation and found it within acceptable parameters. They had calculated the Orson capacity for endurance and found it known. They had not calculated what happened when a half-Orson girl with 12 years of silence, and both inheritances intact, was put alone inside their system and left there. They had not modeled this. An 11-year-old with 3 months of supplies and her mother's maps, and the beginning of a habit of watching the sky. They had not modeled 12 years of patience that was not resignation, of waiting that was not passivity, of a mind turning isolation into methodology and loneliness into cartography. They had not modeled what it looks like when someone keeps going, not because they have hope exactly, but because they have too much to do, and stopping would mean deciding that the doing was pointless. And that was a decision she had never been able to make. They had not modeled the specific stubbornness of a person who has been waiting for so long that they have converted the waiting into work, and the work has become a weapon, and the weapon has been sitting quietly in a way station in a dead corridor for 8 years waiting for someone to use it. They had not modeled her. That was their error. She intended to let them keep making it in as many corridors as she could reach for as long as she could keep working. She saved the file, labeled it with the date, and opened the next one. 3 days after her arrival on the Archon, the Voth moved. She was in the operations room when the alert came through. A clean, low-toned chime that nonetheless caused every person in the room to stop what they were doing and look at the main display board. The board showed 6 Voth Blade-class vessels dropping out of transit at the outer edge of the Corridor 7 approach, tight formation, running dark with their identifier beacons suppressed. The kind of formation that means someone has decided to stop looking and start acting. "They found the cage breach," said the woman at the tactical console. Her name was Commander Iria, compact and gray-templed, an inner-world Orson who had been with the fleet since before the cage went up. She looked at the display board with the flat assessment of someone reading a problem rather than feeling it. 6 blades, Corridor 7 entry point. Search pattern or targeted sweep. "Targeted," Gracia said. Everyone in the room looked at her. She was standing near the back wall, not entirely integrated into the room's social geography yet, in the position of someone who has come in late and hasn't decided where to stand. She crossed to the tactical console and looked at the approach vectors on the display. The blades were moving in the tight V formation that the Voth used when they had a specific location to investigate rather than an area to sweep. She had watched this formation twice from the way station rooftop, and she knew it the way she knew the pulse signatures of the cage nodes. "They're heading for the crash trench," she said. "The trench is still there. The Harriet's residual thermal signature will have dissipated, but there will be scorch patterns from the phase coupler installation. They'll find evidence of repairs. They'll know someone left through the cage." She looked at the approach angle. "They don't have our specific exit point yet. This is confirmation sweep, not pursuit trajectory." Iria studied her for a moment. "You've watched these formations." "For 8 years. You know how they move when they do have a pursuit trajectory." "Yes, they fan out to a 40-degree spread and accelerate to attack speed. This is 32 degrees and they're holding search velocity." She looked at the display. "They know someone was there. They don't know where we went. They're looking for additional physical evidence that might give them a vector." Iria looked at the display again, then at Gracia. Then at her second, a young human man named Asen who had the tightly controlled expression of someone keeping a great many assessments to themselves simultaneously. "Asen, give Gracia full display access." She looked back at the Voth formation on the board. "And get me a plot on Gap 4. I want to know if those blades can reach it before the timing window closes." "Gap 4 opens in 9 hours, Gracia said. "Their current velocity they could reach the approach zone in 7, but Gap 4 requires a specific entry angle 11 degrees off the standard approach corridor. They'll need to have mapped the cage from the inside to know that." She paused. "They haven't. It's their cage. They know where the nodes are, but they don't study the interference patterns from below because they've never needed to. The gaps are invisible from their reference frame." Iria looked at her for a long moment. "Their reference frame," she said slowly, as if tasting the phrase. "They built the cage to keep things in," Gracia said. "They mapped it as a barrier, not a navigation challenge. The gap data I have was derived by studying the cage as a navigational problem, treating the interference nodes as waypoints rather than obstacles. It requires a different model." She looked at the Voth formation on the display. "They will not find the gaps from outside, not without years of observation from below the lattice. They don't have anyone down there to do that work." "They did," Iria said. "They had the Ashrock Flats," Gracia said. "They assumed it was empty." Iria was quiet for a moment. The room was quiet. The only sound was the display board cycling through its routine update and the distant structural hum of the Archon's drives, steady and low, the hum of a thing that keeps moving because stopping would mean deciding that the moving was pointless. "Get me full tactical access for this woman," Iria said, "and tell the pilots I want all 7 gap profiles briefed by end of shift." She looked at the Voth formation one more time. "We're going to start making structural uncertainty a recurring feature of their day." The briefing took 4 hours. Gracia stood at the front of a room full of pilots, human and Orson, and 2 members of species she was still learning the names for, and she walked them through every gap in the resonance cage above Corridor 7. She had spent 12 years alone, and her public speaking skills were what you would expect from 12 years alone, which was to say functional and direct, and without the social smoothing that most people learn from regular contact with other people. She answered questions in order, corrected misunderstandings without softening them, and told 3 pilots separately that their proposed approach vectors would destroy their ships, showing her work each time. By the end of the briefing, the pilots were looking at her with a mixture of expressions, some version of respect, some version of relief, the specific look of people who have been trying to solve a problem for 3 years and have just been handed the solution by someone who solved it without them, alone, in a place they weren't even looking. She did not feel triumphant about this. She felt tired, in the clean way you feel tired after hard work rather than the grinding way you feel tired after long waiting. It was the best kind of tired she had ever felt. Her mother was waiting outside the briefing room. "Good briefing," her mother said. "The approach vectors need more work," Gracia said. 3 of the pilots have timing issues on Gap 2. "I mean," her mother stopped, looked at her, started again. "You were good in there, you're clear. You don't flinch when you have to tell someone they're wrong. There's no benefit to letting someone think they're right when they're not." "No," her mother looked at her for a long moment. "That's something I used to say." Gracia looked at her. She thought about the hum she hadn't known, the song from the inner worlds that she had fallen asleep to as a small child and remembered only as a quality of sound, a particular warmth of frequency, a certain way a voice could settle into a room and make the room feel larger and safer than it was. She had tried to reconstruct it sometimes in the way station, when the silence was particularly dense. She had never quite gotten it. "What is the song?" she said. "The one you used to hum?" Her mother looked at her. Something in her face shifted in the specific way of someone finding a question they weren't expecting and realizing that it is the right one. She hummed 3 bars of it. Gracia stood in the corridor outside the briefing room and listened to it and found that the reconstruction she had been carrying for 12 years was almost right. Not quite. The second bar bent slightly differently, but almost right, which meant that the thing she had been carrying was real. It was a real memory of a real thing, distorted by time but not invented. Not invented. She thought she might say something. She didn't. She said, "I need to get back to the tactical display. Gap 3 window opens in 4 hours and I want to be watching when those blades start their return sweep." Her mother looked at her. "Yes," she said, "all right." Gracia walked back toward the operations room. The Archon hummed around her, large and purposeful, full of the noise of people doing things that mattered. She walked through it the way you walk through something that hasn't entirely become yours yet, but is becoming it incrementally with each step. She passed Cale in the corridor outside the operations room. He had a fresh bandage on his knee and a mug of something hot and the slightly stunned look of someone who has recently been in multiple conversations he hadn't planned for. He looked at her and lifted the mug in a small salute. She nodded. The operations room was loud and bright, and everyone in it was working on a problem that had seemed unsolvable a week ago, and now had 7 solutions, carefully mapped and timed and ready to be used. She found her station at the display board and pulled up Gap 3 and began checking the timing calculations. Outside the Archon, the Voth blades moved in their precise formation through a corridor they thought was sealed, searching for evidence of something they hadn't modeled, operating on the assumption that what was inside their cage was known and contained, and did not require updating. They had been wrong about that for 12 years. She was going to help make sure they stayed wrong for 12 years more. She opened the calculations and started to work.